Let me guess, you're up to your nostrils in crap. Well, your interactive experience begins right now, making spiritual sense of headline news. Live from Internet USA, it's the Bee Sting Radio Show. With your host, Bee Sting.
Tonight's show's going to chew your brain up like a piece of bubble gum, and it may even spit it out. You better go get some coffee for your brain. I'm not kidding you. You better be wide awake for this one. Tonight's show, we're going to be addressing the Shroud of Turin. Now, before we get started, I want you to understand, this is a disclaimer, Bee Sting Talk Radio. We're neither your minister, nor are we your psychologist. We're a marketing company that focuses directly on the soul inside of you. We do brand awareness for your soul. We filter out all the white noise and the sheer amount of media events that are hell-bent to confuse you and fog your vision. Now, all you have to remember is www.beestingtalkradio.com. From there, you can launch anywhere. That said, I hope you enjoy the show. The Shroud of Turin. When I studied it closely, it was the biggest single turning event in my faith, and that God actually existed, that Christ actually existed, into seeing both the God and the Christ as actual beings. As real to me as the headphones and microphone I'm wearing right now. The Shroud to me is like the first time a person sees the ocean. Growing up on the beach, I watched them stand there for hours sometimes with their jaw just dropped open, trying to take it all in. That's my exact reaction to the Shroud. Here's the good news, folks, that in 1 hour, you are going to be an expert on the Shroud. I promise you brand new information that you've never even known. Throughout this show, everybody needs to bear in mind that the Shroud of Turin is and always has been a confirmed, documented, and confined homicide site. Any evidence that could be introduced to the crime scene was well before anybody knew where science would be today. So for someone 700 years ago, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, to understand technology today, which they would have had to do in order to introduce confusing elements of the Shroud, is, I think we can all agree, an impossibility. Now, when I mentioned seeing the ocean for the first time, I want you to multiply that exponentially. Exponentially, because I actually believe that the Shroud is a scientific key. It was left as a piece of evidence for mankind to discover and fully understand that God is a perfect element. This means the question of why doesn't God prove himself is now old school. He has. I think the Shroud does that. Here's this piece of evidence, this piece of material that has been combed over by a team of scientists since 1978, 79. And in the end, they can't even explain how the image got on the cloth. On October 8th, 1978, a group of scientists went to the Vatican, and for 120 hours, straight through, they performed thousands of scientific tests. This group was called STRP, by the way, which is an acronym for Shroud of Turin Research Project. There were chemists, there was a physicist, thermodynamics expert, jet propulsion expert, nuclear physicists, and more. 120 hours. They had 16 scientists working around the clock. That is 1,920 man-hours of scientific study. All that, and their conclusion was, when they left, they didn't know what the Shroud was, but they knew what it wasn't. It wasn't painted on. They found 0 dyes. 0. Now, I'm going to reverse engineer my argument, okay? because we know in the end they didn't know what it was. They didn't know. Today, using science, computers, calculators, and an aggregate scientific IQ, these men couldn't figure out at all, wouldn't speculate on how that image got on that piece of cloth. That's amazing. Now, everybody that listens to this show knows I talk about Las Vegas odds and how odds are meant to be reset every time you pick up and roll the dice. I repeat, never bet against mathematical odds. So, here we are. You ready for this? Are you my Huckleberry? The calculated odds this team came up with that the man in the shroud is a person other than Christ Jesus of Nazareth is, ready for this? Sitting down, 1 in 282 billion. And we'll repeat that. A 1 in 82 billion chance that this image was anybody other than the Christ, and they weren't even sure if it was the Christ. And in Las Vegas, a wager with 1 in 50 odds is considered a sucker's bet. That should about put it in perspective for you guys. And a rule of thumb for tonight's show, there's actually 2 different elements that fit together like a key and a keyhole. That's the shroud, and that's the face cloth. The book of John was very specific on the face cloth. That was found in another part of the world. We're not even going to address that. We're talking about the shroud only, even though the face cloth was discovered. And on every single point, 120 different points, it matches from blood to image with the shroud in a different part of the world, to include an image that no scientist can understand or explain or even try to explain. So for right now, we're just going to assume that the face cloth and the shroud are one and the same. 1 in 282 billion to 1. I'm going to put that in perspective for you. Let's say there are 282 billion stars in the sky. If you use a telescope, you give one person one shot, and at random, they pick the star that you've got written down on a piece of paper. Now, that's magic. Best magicians in illusionists in Las Vegas, they wouldn't even try to reverse engineer that little parlor trick. Not to mention, I keep saying I'm not going to mention the face cloth, but the milling of the face cloth, the linen, and its weave matches perfectly with the shroud. They were a complete set. Now, there are 8 different types of blood in the human population. O2 is the most common, with 37% of the Caucasian population and 47% of the African American population. Hispanics, 53%. Asians, 39%. That means that 44% of the population, 44 out of 100 people, are out of the realm of possibility. You can be excused. The bloodstains from the shroud have passed multiple scientific tests, and they prove to be, ready for this, AB positive. Only 2.72% of the human population is considered in this whopping equation. 97.25% can go ahead and leave the room. You can't be the one in the shroud. You're not even inside the realm of possibilities. And again, that's if they chose an AB positive person to beat the hell out of, put him in a shroud, sometime or somehow come up with his image on it with AB positive blood before they even knew what AB positive blood was or what our test would be for today. Absolutely outrageous. An assumption that someone created this shroud. To say so is just a form of quitting. Remember, too, that to duplicate this, to create some sort of illusion, to duplicate this, not only would you have to beat the hell out of the person, you'd have to crucify him. And you'd have to crucify him so slowly that bilirubin pops out of his pores. I mean, even if you believe the carbon dating 1260 to 1380, whatever it was. So back then, somebody came up with a shroud, and maybe in 1600, they didn't even understand blood types. That's back when they used to put leeches on you if you had a flu. They threw you overboard to see if you would sink or swim, float, to find out if you were a witch. It even predates that. We're talking medieval times. Somebody made the And since the shroud was discovered, one of the single most notable irregularities of the entire subject was bright red bloodstains. From the beginning, everybody said, oh, those can't be bloodstains. This was before they could test for bloodstains. Those can't be bloodstains. They're entirely too bright red. They're too predominant. Dried up blood is much darker than that, muddy or coffee looking. I said coffee for all my northern listeners. The bright red blood was the most notable argument against the shroud's authenticity since day one to 1978 when it was studied. Now, I'm going on about the hue of the red blood, but I want you to understand that the red blood, the color of the red, the reason why the red is the color it is the smoking gun of the shroud. It's the single most important element of the entire event. Put a pin in that. We're going to return to it. I couldn't explain to you now why the blood was red. You wouldn't understand, but you will in a little while. Now, since the blood stains have been in a laboratory studied by scientists, they have found excessive amounts of bilirubin. If you don't know what bilirubin is, it shows up in the blood. It's found in blood with someone who experiences massive trauma, like a crucifixion, like the beating that Christ took before he was crucified, when he was beaten unmercifully. They did everything they could to beat him, to pass pain onto him, to disgrace him, to take him to the lowest levels possible. But when someone has elongated trauma, bilirubin pops up all through their blood. Now, bilirubin alone doesn't keep blood bright red for 2,000 years. That's no explanation for why the blood, they just found bilirubin throughout the blood. However, if bilirubin, once in the blood, is exposed to ultraviolet rays, it dramatically brightens the color of the blood, and it remains that way. But now we need ultraviolet rays back then? I mean, that seems impossible. But at least we know that bilirubin was found in the blood on the shroud. And when mixed with ultraviolet rays, it stays a bright red, and the blood is a bright red. So we have to leave that on the table for consideration. You just got to. But again, we're going to put a pin in that. We will return. I promise you, we are going to return to the bilirubin and the ultraviolet rays. I promise you. Now, I'm going to go over a few things because this show is going to be full of facts. I mean, ostensibly, this should be close to a, college level, classroom experience. So we've got a shroud made of linen. We've got an image on a shroud made of linen that the aggregate IQ of the scientific community, with the use of computers and telephones and fax and emails and photographs that we'll get into later, all of those things, those scientists can't even explain how the image got onto the linen cloth. We're going to break for a commercial. When we come back, we're going to get into more of this, and I promise you, in 45 minutes, I promise you may well look at God and the Christ in a much more realistic way. You will be able to reach out and touch Him. We'll be right back. You're probably asking yourself, why start Bee Sting Talk Radio? I mean, the world's already saturated with enough radio and television shows, right? Then there's blogs, websites, internet feeds, Twitter, Facebook, texting, teleconferencing. Yet, with that bizarre amount of information distributed, how come so many of us are still starved for the truth? Especially regarding what is God, what is Satan? How do they all fit into today's headline news, and who serves whom? Now let's honor the actual numbers. Hundreds of millions of us are now starving, craving for the answer to the one big question. What the hell's going on in our world? You know the world has stumbled upon its own precipice, and we all want to know what's going to happen next if we don't change direction immediately. Or is it simply too late? If this sounds like you, you may have just found your new home. Bee Sting Talk Radio is a living, breathing community that studies today's headlines from a spiritual perspective with interactive talk radio, original videos, blogs, and updates that include experts to help us study the war between pure good and pure evil. Because we all know it's about the human soul. We are the spiritual truth behind headline news, because a soul is a terrible thing to waste. Welcome to Bee Sting Talk Radio. Now, the Bible's description of the brutal beating that the Romans gave Christ is exactly consistent with what bloodstains and where the bloodstains are on the shroud. Perfect match. In it of itself doesn't mean anything. It's all of the other contributing factors that merge together in this one piece of evidence, which is actually, as we discussed before, a homicide site. In today's terms, they would have surrounded the shroud with do not cross tape, the yellow stuff with the black writing on it. The blood found on the shroud was also proven in laboratory studies to be post-mortem blood. Again, post-mortem blood doesn't prove anything except for the fact that someone 1,700, 1,000, 2,000 years ago would have had to know that post-mortem blood was any different than living blood. Now, there were 7 extremely rare occurrences with all the blood that was tested on the shroud. 1, the blood was AB positive. We've talked about that. Very rare. Second rarest blood form there is. 2, the blood was post-mortem. 3, at the time of the introduction to the shroud, the blood introduction to the shroud, the blood was fresh, meaning that the person in the shroud had just died. Post-mortem meaning he's dead, fresh blood meaning he had just died. 4, the shroud was vacant of clotted blood. 5, the blood flows on the shroud indicate gravity, meaning that the body was placed rather than the blood being poured. The body was placed in the shroud, and it ran its normal course of gravity through muscles, through fingers, down the sides of the face, curlicuing out of where his thorns were placed. Gravity pulled that blood in a very natural direction. That's vitally important. Multiple forensic experts agree that the shroud is an indication that the events that took place to that body in the shroud, Christ or not, were very, very consistent with what the Bible describes as his last hours. From the way his head was bleeding from thorns, to where he was and how he was cut on his side, to include the flow of the blood, the holes where the nails went, the fact that the holes in the nails would cut a nerve in your hand that draws your thumb inward. Neither hand shows a thumb. Excessive amounts, elevated levels of bilirubin. Additionally, forensic scientists found absolutely no evidence of decomposition. None. Plus, STRP found evidence of pollen consistent with pollen in the air during Passover in Jerusalem, with mineral deposits consistent with caves in and around Jerusalem. So there's your homicide site for you. There's the body of someone or something of a human form that has somehow appeared on a shroud. We're going to get to that next. But there's your homicide scene. That's what the blood looked like. That's what the consistencies with the trauma to the body, with the bilirubin, and the stories in the Bible. Now let's talk about the image. This image, this shroud, this article that is now considered the single most scientifically studied item in the world. The image itself is now considered the only image in the world offering mirrored horizontal effects. Mirrored horizontal effects, color reversal, and 3D qualities. On the earth have all three, meaning that the cloth and the image match when draped over and around a person. But it even gets more interesting than that. The shroud was analyzed with a VP8. Now, if that's a video compression format system that converts photographs into three-dimensional objects. I mean, if you guys have ever been on Google Earth, you've used this technology. It takes the light and dark of elements of a photograph and it projects that image into a 3D grid. This eliminates all speculation of art. In fact, it has absolutely no influence inside the VP8 software solution, not art. They took a Rembrandt sketch and put it inside VP8 software solution technology. And it came out a very grainy, almost couldn't even tell what the sketch was like. Here's where it gets even crazier. You can't even take a picture of a person's face in a studio, introduce it into VP8 formatting, and map yourself a three-dimensional face object inside the software solution. It just doesn't work. Yet, the image on the shroud works perfectly. When the STRP guys introduced the shroud photograph into the VP8 software solution technology back then in 1978. I mean, this was state-of-the-art back then. They couldn't even believe they had the machine. They were stupefied at what they saw. It literally blew their minds. A clear and distinct 3D image pops up in front of these scientists, right next to the shroud. Even the hair in the 3D image shows a distinct 3D personality, all on its own, the hair. You can see how it rolls around. Look, here's a group of scientists that the Vatican allows in to study the shroud, and almost immediately they concluded, unanimously concluded, that the Shroud of Turin was an image unlike anything else on Earth. Period. Its properties shared with nothing, and nothing shares its properties. 3D dimensional relief on both the front side, the anterior, and the posterior side. Remember, this cloth wrapped around the body. It's got a perfect image of the backside of whoever's in there, front and back, 3D, perfect. No, somebody would, well, let's throw out the realm of possibility at this point in time that anybody could duplicate this, no matter, independent of any agenda they may have. And according to these scientists, even if they had a time machine and left today to go back there to reproduce it, they don't have a clue how to do it. Not a clue. Folks, when software experts and scientists won't even speculate on how to produce something, that's a powerful fact. The same scientific union that bases every result on scientific facts can't even explain how this image even exists on a scientific level. Let that break into your imagination for a while. Why don't you marinate in that fact for a little while? They can tell us it's not the Christ, but they can't even tell us how the image was formed. Believe me when I tell you this defrocks many a scientist. During the 120-hour scientific study of the Shroud, they ran spectral analysis. They used an instrument called a spectrophotometer. Now, there's a word you don't want to try to say 3 times in a row. Spectrophotometer. Now, hang with me because this is vitally important. This instrument is used to produce or record a spectrum or a light field in measuring photometric intensity of each wavelength. So what happens is this thing takes an image like the Shroud and turns it into light waves that can be studied and compared. It studies the intensity of light, it defines wavelengths and how they're transmitted, and it can even measure the amount of material in the solution absorbing the light. They use this to understand why the stain or the image absorbs certain lights. And it can also be used, here we go back to ultraviolet lights, it can also be used to measure the amount of ultraviolet activity on a site. Objects exist to the human eye by the way light plays on it. This just measures that. I don't want you to get lost in the details of all of these different instruments and tests. It's not that important. It is important to understand the basics of this because in the end, I have got something to tell you that is going to blow your mind. This is so worth what we're going through right now. I promise you. The reason why this machine was used is because a lot of the light rays that play off of objects aren't inside the realm of light that humans can see. So this instrument sees for us. It sees things in the Shroud that the human eye can't even imagine. And there's proof after proof and documented proof after documented proof that blew STRP's minds when they saw these images through this spectrophotometer. Stuff you can't duplicate because you don't see it anyway. So here are these STRP scientists analyzing this Shroud, and they find absolutely no dyes on the cloth, no paint, no foreign matter, nothing that comprises the image. The image is so thin that it is only on the anterior side of the fibers. The image is so thin, it didn't even work its way inside the fibers. It literally floats on the outside of the fibers and only on one side. Again, massively important information. I mean, these guys had X-ray fluorescent cameras. They were using ultraviolet photography. They X-rayed the Shroud. They prodded and investigated and looked at and analyzed this Shroud 10 ways to Sunday for 120 hours, 1,920 man hours. And the result? They didn't know what they were looking at. It was there. The image could be seen. They had no idea how it got there. So we've got postmortem blood full of bilirubin from prolonged, protracted trauma. We have that blood on an image that matches everything the Bible talked about as far as his brutal beating. We've got a Christ that prophecy foretold would never suffer a broken bone, which is consistent with exactly what is seen on the Shroud. This man also, if not Christ, was crucified before put in a shroud, according to prophecy, that had no broken bones, consistent with the shroud. We're going to take a break, let this marinate on you, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes. Hang on. I promise you the end result is going to be worth all of this legwork. Be right back.
You're listening to WIN, Workers Independent News, a production of Diversified Media Enterprises.
For Workers Independent News, I'm Joanne Powers. President Barack Obama has come under fire from immigration and labor activists over an announcement Saturday that he intends to delay executive action on immigration reform until after this November's congressional elections. The president had vowed to take action by the end of the summer. Arturo Rodriguez, president of the United Farm Workers, accused the president of breaking his promise to millions of immigrants and Latinos, saying, quote, "Justice delayed is justice denied. Consequently, hardworking immigrants will continue to be vulnerable, exploited, and not receive the respect and dignity they deserve." U.S. Representative Gwen Moore of Milwaukee was among scores of demonstrators arrested in civil disobedience actions at fast food restaurants across the nation on Thursday. The protests were part of the Fight for 15 strike, demanding hourly wage increases to $15 for workers in the highly profitable industry. Moore stressed the effectiveness of civil disobedience in making tremendous change in our society.
To the extent that there's such an unwillingness on the part of my colleagues in Congress, I am taking guidance from one of my heroes, John Lewis, who says that you just have to put your body at stake. You have to put yourself in the way. And following that tradition, I woke up at 5:20 yesterday morning knowing that I was going to inconvenience myself, cost myself money, risk being injured, but I felt really compelled to do it. And I'd be willing to do it again, yes.
Airlines are one of few U.S. industries with a highly unionized workforce. Last Tuesday, the U.S. Department of Transportation refused to permit an exemption for Norwegian Air International to fly in the U.S. while its foreign air carrier permit application is being considered. The airline plans to operate in the U.S. with pilots hired in Singapore and contracted flight attendants in order to avoid labor standards in Norway and the U.S. Sarah Nelson, international president of the Association of Flight Attendants, which represents 60,000 U.S. workers, says the DOT needs to reject the NAI application outright.
We have been working with the unions in Norway to fight this because this is undercutting labor standards that were negotiated as part of the Open Skies Agreement between the U.S. and the EU. They will be setting a standard that many other airlines will follow. They would simply go to where the lowest standards are for labor or any other economic considerations. We will see the degradation of the U.S. airline industry and U.S. jobs.
Workers Independent News is brought to you with support from union-owned, union-represented Bank of Labor. Bank of Labor has provided trust and fiduciary services to labor organizations for nearly a century. Online at bankoflabor.com.
You've been listening to WIN, Workers Independent News. For more information, visit laborradio.org.
A stunning amount of very specific Bible prophecies have been fully executed. From the birth of the leopard to the caliphate, where the caliphate comes from and the direction of its growth. The Euphrates River drawing, to wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation. Global news providers are comprised of lies and deceit, hell-bent on creating a false reality, while using dishonesty for their existence, like the earth uses hydrogen and oxygen for its existence. At the same time, Christians are being persecuted and beheaded globally, killed by Muslims who roll across the earth. Worst yet, I only mentioned a mere few facts. The 7 deadly sins define global corporations: pride, envy, gluttony, lust, anger, greed, and sloth. These same global corporations are experimenting with plant and animal DNA, water, weather, the air we breathe, the food we eat, while paying consulting firms hundreds of millions every year to promote the dishonesty and the satanic deceit. Pharmaceutical interests fill our bodies with poisons, selling us pharmaceuticals we don't need because the diseases don't actually exist. They want to make God's inventions their inventions. They execute social and governmental experiments, essentially changing everything God made. What is the mathematical probability that all these specifically foretold events have materialized by pure and mere happenstance? Seek counsel with the Las Vegas odds maker. See what he says. The Bible has quickly transformed from a book of fairy tales into a blueprint of and roadmap through this exact matrix. It's not your grandfather's Bible anymore. Join us at Bee Sting Talk Radio. We've got plenty to talk about.
This is Bee Sting Talk Radio.
So we got a lot of the science out of the way. We got the murder scene, the homicide scene. We've got that down pat. We've got the blood stains. We've got an image that nobody can explain why or how it exists. Now the fun part starts. Now, since STRP was there doing their 1,920 hours worth of investigation, they decided, the Vatican, after a great struggle within, Pope John Paul decided to sacrifice some of the shroud for carbon dating. Okay? Now, huge tensions arise. I mean, you got to imagine that, this carbon dating could prove or disprove the shroud. And Christianity is based around the resurrection. The shroud is this thing that we're all hoping exists, but we're not quite sure yet because the scientific tests hadn't been run. It was a real Vatican Mayday, heyday kind of jockeying for position type thing, but they sacrificed the shroud, piece of the shroud, a corner of the shroud, cut into 4 pieces and transported to 3 different scientific locations, laboratories with carbon dating machines. Now, carbon dating is real easy to understand. All forms of life on Earth have approximately the same amount of carbon-14. And that carbon-14 doesn't change as long as the animal or plant lives. Now, when it dies, it has a certain depreciation of the carbon-14. So any material that was made from a living object, they count the remaining carbon-14, match that to standards, and you can pretty much tell the age of almost anything that lived, even though it's dead. Pretty standard and simple concept. I'm sure the application therein is very difficult and it takes scientists to do it. So they carbon dated this swatch, if you will. Not the swath, a swatch. 3 different locations. And the results varied from the year 1260 to 1390. Atheists were jumping up and down. They couldn't have been happier. Christians worldwide were just devastated, quaked to their foundation. Quaked. Their faith was questioned. Here's this medieval cloth, no doubt about it. And unfortunately for many, that was the end of the story. They kind of just stowed it away. They put it in a locker somewhere in their brain and just forgot about the shroud. Can't be. Christ? Nah, man. 1260 to 1390? Nah, Christ is out. However, during the 1600s, well, raise your hand if you've ever heard of French reweaving. It was a popular way in the 1600s to repair important garments, like a shroud. That's when weavers would weave into existing cloth patches or bonds with newer material. The cloth was then dyed to match the original. So what they actually did was they would pull the threads apart and then literally weave thread by thread by wrapping them together, thus seamlessly adding one piece of material to another. So this woman, Sue Benford, and her husband, Joe Marino from Ohio, didn't take to this carbon dating thing. They didn't like the concept. Neither one of them was a scientist, I might add. They just got the notion that this weaving process may well have been introduced onto the shroud over the many years. Now, this pissed off the STRP guys. Fortunately, STRP took tons of conclusive photographs without even knowing it. The STRP team and their evidence would come back into play heavily. Now, Ray Rogers was one of the lead scientists in STRP on the STRP team, and he took exception to Sue Benford and Joe Marino, who brought into question science in the absence of all science. He was flaming mad. In fact, he told the STRP team, bring me whatever, theory they've got, and I'll shoot it down in 5 minutes. Sue's contention was, if this weaving theory was true, then a 2,000-year-old cloth would have carbon, and a 400-year-old cloth would have carbon, and then you'd have to average it out. If each existed in the same amounts, so if one was 40%, the other one was 60%, the results would slide all over the place, probably slide right off the table, depending on the quantity ratios. And since Ray Rogers, a part of the original STRP team, one, couldn't stand Sue because she wasn't a scientist pushing her theories in his industry, and two, Ray couldn't stand people who didn't use science, Ray still had in his possession tape samples of the material from the shroud. Fibers, albeit no cloth, but he had materials in hand. So he set about to make good on his word to the STRP team. I'm going to shoot her theory down in 5 minutes. So he took the material and her theory into the laboratory, and guess what happened? Ray found cotton fibers inside his sample batch from a linen shroud. This from Ray Rogers, who has no ability to eschew from science, shows no flexibility from science, and he found reweaving had occurred. When he discovered cotton fibers inconsistent with the rest of the shroud, in fact, he found plenty of cotton. He found vast amounts of cotton in his sample kit. And worse yet, he found dyes in the cotton. That's right, the cotton was not only dyed, he found traces of a wax additive to cotton to absorb dyes better. They rewove the corner, and then they dyed it to match the rest of the shroud. So Ray Rogers contacts the STRP team and has them forward him all of the ultraviolet photographs, and discovered a very peculiar dark green area around what was used for the carbon-14 dating. He had to conclude the results of the carbon-14 testing that were conclusive were actually inconclusive, and greatly so. In fact, Ray Rogers concluded that the main body of the shroud had absolutely nothing to do with the part that was carbon dated. In fact, God rest his soul in peace, weeks before his death, he confirmed that he didn't agree with any hoaxes or theories, but in fact had come to believe, through his scientific studies, that the Shroud of Turin was in fact used to bury the Christ Jesus. He was so bothered by having to admit that before he died, he actually forwarded not only those fibers, but found the shroud material itself and had all of that forwarded to a guy named Bob Villarreal he's a chemist at Los Alamos Laboratories. and each of Bob Rogers' findings were exactly the same as Los Alamos laboratories. Now, these are the words of scientists, not my words. These are after conclusive tests have been run. These are not my concepts. Now, as far as STRP is concerned, okay, these are chemists, physicists, thermodynamic experts, jet propulsion guys, nuclear physicists. These guys can't even begin to tell you from a scientific perspective how that image got on that cloth. But that doesn't always matter. Science is a broad subject. Now, physicists, they're a part of the scientific community, and they have plenty of theories about how that image got on that cloth. And this is the part I told you was going to amaze you. And remember, this image and the way it was transferred onto this material, this linen, is so advanced of what we have right now, we can't even duplicate it to prove or deny this is how it got there. But here's what the physicists say. It takes energy, not only energy, a massive burst of enormous sums of energy, simultaneously in every direction. The energy aged the fabric, the fibers, aged the process of those fibers, which is what left the image. The image you see is actually older than the rest of the linen. And oh, it gets deeper. Both are consistent through the shroud and the face cloth. Enter Dame Piczek, a particle physicist, explains the occurrence in a very simple to understand fashion. There must have been another anomaly occurring at the moment of the energy explosion from the front side and the back side of the shroud simultaneously. In order for this to happen and leave the image, the shroud itself had to be taut, rigidly taut, perfectly so. At the same time, the body had to be elevated, floating, if you would, for this to occur. With the energy passing through the shroud, it would leave an energy print. Now, the reason why the body had to be floating or suspended in air was because the shroud shows no evidence whatsoever of muscular depression, meaning that there was no weight on either side of the body, the interior or the posterior side. It simply wasn't laying on rock and flattening out the muscles, meaning it had to be floating, levitating at the time of the energy burst. Now, the surface of a black hole creates what's called an event horizon, sort of like the edge of a waterfall. Once you go past that, all energy and matter change. Therefore, so do the laws of physics, and they dramatically change. This creates a dividing interface, and the image is projected up and down. When an event horizon upgrades to a collapsed event horizon, well, that's what scientists call singularity. These events are exactly what started the universe in the Big Bang Theory. According to Piczek, the exact same explosion of the Big Bang happened inside that shroud, and the energy, the light, left itself, the Christ, on the shroud. Piczek said, and I quote, "We have nothing less in the tomb of Christ at the moment of a collapsed universe than the beginning of a new universe." Again, these are scientists saying all of this, not me. I mean, I agree with it, but this is modern science explaining the Bible. I mean, for a second, enjoy that irony. Science is now explaining the Bible. Now, at the beginning of the show, I was teasing you over and over and over. I would put a pin in it, put a pin in it. Remember that extremely red blood that needed to be mixed with ultraviolet rays? We just found the energy source that mixed with the bilirubin mixed with the ultraviolet rays that were seemingly impossible, now explained. This brings up a very interesting dichotomy. Since the death of Christ, Christians have been asking, why would God want the Christ to be beaten unmercifully before he was hung to die on a cross? Why would any father want his son to go through that much pain? And a lot of Christians sop it up with, albeit biblical scriptures that talk about that was to forgive us the blood, to bathe over top of us, to rid us of our sins. But you've got to ask this very interesting question. Did God have to let Christ go through that so that the bilirubin was in his blood and leaves evidence for science to finally catch up to prove God's existence, and even more so, Christ's existence, and even more so, what defines perfectly the resurrection? Must Christ have gone through those horrible beatings to have the hemoglobin in his body that the ultraviolet rays would pick up? How much of the end days of Christ and his persecution and the beating he got over protracted amounts of time was absolutely needed to scientifically prove God when the time was right? Perfectly placed on that 2,000-year-long timeline since Christ's death. Perfectly placed with all of the other predictions. Science just proved God's existence. Thank you for listening to our show tonight. Please make sure that you visit beestingtalkradio.com. It's your main hub. There you can find clearly marked links to our Facebook page, YouTube channels, Twitter, SoundCloud, Blog Talk Radio page, and a link to email us. Keep your head on a swivel, folks. Pay attention to your soul and pray. Remember, all the answers and tools you need are inside the Bible. Have a blessed and safe journey through the rest of this day, and may God bless you. Good night.